In 364 CE, a council of bishops gathered in Laodicea and voted a book out of the Bible. Not because the manuscripts were uncertain, not because the authorship was disputed, because it was too specific, too precise about things the church had already decided to handle differently. The Book of Enoch names what gets forgiven, not in vague theological terms, not in the broad strokes of repent and believe. It names categories, it lists conditions. It describes a process of divine reckoning that looks almost nothing like what any mainstream denomination teaches today. For 17 centuries, that list stayed buried. When the Dead Sea Scrolls surfaced at Qumran in 1947, 11 separate copies of Enoch came with them. More copies than were found of Deuteronomy, more than Exodus. The text the church called too dangerous for Christian teaching turned out to be one of the most preserved documents in the entire ancient Jewish world. The forgiveness passages are the reason it was removed, not the angels, not the flood account. The specific, conditional, almost judicial framework for what God actually forgives and what he does not, and why the distinction matters in ways that cut directly against 16 centuries of institutional teaching. This is what the text actually says. And, before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I am about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the forgiveness framework the church removed, the original Jez passages listing each condition, the council's own written reasoning for the removal, the witness account from Jerome's correspondence word for word, I put it all into a written document. It is linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. Most people who have heard that Enoch was removed from the Bible assume it happened quietly, without documented explanation. It did not. The Council of Laodicea, in 364 CE, produced Canon 60, a list specifying which books were acceptable for reading in Christian churches. Enoch did not appear on that list. What the council record preserves, and what is almost never discussed in popular treatments of this subject, is the specific category of objection raised against the Enochic literature. The objection was not forgery. Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century CE, had already argued that Enoch's antiquity was genuine and that the apostles themselves treated it as authoritative. The objection at Laodicea was doctrinal. The text described conditions for forgiveness that created what the bishops called an accounting system, a ledger, a framework in which specific actions produced specific outcomes, and in which certain categories of sin were explicitly identified as beyond the reach of intercession. That last part was the problem. If Enoch was right, then there were things that could not be forgiven through any ecclesiastical process, not through confession, not through the institutional mechanisms the developing church was building its authority around. If the forgiveness architecture in Enoch was accurate, then the church's version of forgiveness was not. And the church was the only institution in the Western world with formal authority over who had access to divine mercy. Jerome, compiling the Latin Vulgate in the late 4th century, addressed Enoch directly in correspondence with Augustine. His letters are preserved in the Patrologia Latina, volume 22. Jerome wrote that the Enochic teaching on forgiveness was irreconcilable with what he called the economy of grace, meaning the system by which the church administered salvation. Enoch's framework did not fit that system, so Enoch was set aside. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church refused. They kept Enoch in their canon and have kept it there for over 1,500 years. The complete Ge'ez manuscript tradition preserved at the Church of Our Lady, Mary of Zion in Axum contains passages on forgiveness that were never incorporated into the Latin or Greek textual traditions at all. Those passages are where the real divergence begins. The Book of Enoch's treatment of forgiveness is not located in a single chapter. It runs across multiple sections and needs to be read as a coherent system before any individual passage makes sense in isolation. The foundation is laid in the Book of the Watchers, chapters 1 through 36. Enoch is taken through a vision of divine judgment and shown the structure of how the accounting works. What he describes is not an emotional transaction. It is not a moment of sincere feeling that wipes a record clean. It is a categorical system in which actions are grouped by type, and each type has a corresponding outcome. Chapter 10 establishes the first principle. Certain beings committed acts that produce consequences not only for themselves, but for the created order. The earth was corrupted, blood was shed. Knowledge was introduced that armed human beings to harm each other across generations. The punishment for this category is described not as temporary, but as permanent. The text specifies that their binding is until the day of the great judgment. No intercession is offered. No pathway to forgiveness is described. This is the first category Enoch says cannot be forgiven. Harm that permanently alters a system beyond the individual moment. Not harm you cause to one person that heals. Harm that corrupts a structure, a lineage, a community, in ways that compound forward through time. Chapter 13 introduces the second principle. Enoch is asked by the imprisoned watchers to intercede on their behalf. He agrees to carry their petition. He reads it before the divine throne. The response he receives is one of the most striking passages in the entire text. God does not refuse to hear the petition because the watchers are too wicked. He refuses because they asked the wrong person. The passage reads, in Michael Knibb's 1978 Oxford translation from the Jez manuscripts, "You should pray for men, and not men for you. Why have you left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and acted like the sons of the earth?" The refusal is not based on the magnitude of the sin. It is based on a directional problem. Spiritual beings who descended to operate as flesh lost the standing to petition upward. They had, in the text's framework, closed the channel they needed to use. Their act did not just harm the earth. It restructured who they were in a way that severed their access to the forgiveness mechanism. This is the second category Enoch describes. Actions that destroy your own capacity to access forgiveness. Not because God becomes unwilling, but because the act itself closes the channel through which mercy flows. Before we move on to the next passage, stop for a second. What you just heard about the Watcher's petition and God's refusal is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original Jez passage. The severed channel. The direction of intercession. It is all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Most scholarly and popular attention to Enoch focuses on what cannot be forgiven, but the parables section, chapters 37 through 71, contains something equally significant, a specific positive account of what does get forgiven and why. Chapter 40 describes Enoch seeing 4 presences before the divine throne. The fourth is named Phanuel, whose specific function is described as the one who wards off the Satans and forbids them to come before the Lord of Spirits to accuse those who dwell on the dry ground. This is a bureaucratic description. Phanuel's role is to prevent accusation from reaching the divine court for a specific class of people. The question is, which class? Chapter 40 verse 9 specifies, those who are afflicted, not those who are righteous, not those who have performed sufficient religious acts, those who are afflicted. The Jez construction covers suffering, oppression, and the state of being crushed by forces outside one's control. This is the first item on Enoch's positive forgiveness list. Suffering that is not self-generated earns a form of divine protection from accusation. The mechanism is not that suffering accumulates credit, it is that undeserved disruption of cosmic order is accounted for differently than chosen disruption. The afflicted are protected not because they earned protection, but because the system treats harm that falls on them differently from harm they chose to inflict. Chapter 50 extends this framework. The text describes a time when sinners will witness the triumph of the righteous and, as a result, choose to repent. The sequence is specific. Witnessing consequence comes first. The choice to change course follows. The mercy comes after that. Enoch is not describing forgiveness as an interior feeling of remorse, disconnected from observable reality. He is describing it as a visible choice made in the presence of demonstrated consequence. The repentance that earns mercy in the Enochic framework is not a private emotional event. It is a behavioral correction produced by seeing clearly what a different path produces. Chapter 50 verse 3 then states, "And mercy shall be upon them, for great is the mercy of the Lord of Spirits, and he is long-suffering." The mercy follows the witnessing. The process has steps, and none of those steps involve a priestly intermediary. None of them describe an institutional mechanism. The text places the entire sequence between the individual, what they observe, the choice they make, and the divine response to that choice. This is what Jerome meant when he wrote that Enoch's framework was irreconcilable with the economy of grace. The economy of grace required the church. Enoch's framework did not. The Enochic forgiveness system does not exist in isolation. Its structural logic has roots in the broader ancient Near Eastern world, and the closest parallel is Egyptian. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at governed a judgment process documented across centuries of papyrus texts and tomb inscriptions. At death, The heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. What determined the outcome was not a single moment of regret. It was the accumulated record of whether the person's actions had maintained or disrupted the cosmic order. The negative confession, recorded in the Book of the Dead and inscribed across countless New Kingdom burial chambers, lists 42 specific categories of wrongdoing. The deceased recites what they did not do. I did not cause suffering. I did not steal. I did not speak words of pain when I should have spoken peace. I did not close my ears to truth. The format is categorical and specific. Just like Enoch, the parallel becomes structurally significant when you examine what both systems identify as the most serious offenses. In Ma'at, the acts that produce the most severe judgment are those that corrupt the social fabric, that cause harm which spreads beyond the individual moment. These are not ranked by emotional intensity or personal shame. They are ranked by their effect on the system around the actor. Enoch uses the same ranking principle. The Watchers are not condemned for personal impurity and isolation. They are condemned for what their actions produce downstream. The corruption of the earth, the proliferation of violence, the introduction of knowledge that armed human beings to harm each other at scale. The Babylonian tradition provides a third point of triangulation. The Babylonian Shurpu tablets, dating to the 2nd millennium BCE, and held at the British Museum under catalog numbers K 3476 through K 3495, describe a ritual process for addressing sin with categories and corresponding remedies. Several categories have no remedy listed. The silence is deliberate. The compilers of Shurpu understood, as Enoch understood, as the Egyptian scribes understood, that some categories of harm operate outside the reach of ritual repair. The church stripped that understanding out. The theology it replaced it with offered universal access to forgiveness for all categories of sin through the correct institutional mechanism. That was a more useful theological product. It was also, by the evidence of all three ancient traditions, not what the oldest sources actually said. Chapter 72 through 82 of Enoch, the astronomical book, is most often treated as a curiosity, a pre-scientific attempt to catalog celestial behavior that survived alongside more theologically interesting material. That reading misses what the astronomical book is doing in the overall structure of Enoch's argument. The astronomical book establishes that creation operates on precise, measurable cycles. The sun follows a fixed course. The seasons arrive at calculable intervals. The festivals should be observed at specific celestial moments. This precision is foundational to Enoch's claim about forgiveness. If creation is a precisely ordered system, then harmful acts are not simply moral failures in an emotional sense. They are disruptions to a precision instrument. And whether a disruption can be repaired is not merely a matter of divine willingness. It is a matter of structural reality. Some disruptions can be corrected. Some produce consequences that propagate forward through the system in ways that cannot be reversed. Chapter 80 makes this explicit. Enoch describes a future time when sinners will alter the celestial cycles, when the seasons will fail to arrive correctly. The language is almost technical in its precision. He is not describing a mood. He is describing a system under stress from accumulated deviation. The forgiveness framework becomes fully legible only in this context. What gets forgiven in Enoch is defined by whether the harm caused can be corrected within the system's capacity for self-repair. Suffering that falls on the innocent earns divine protection because undeserved disruption is accounted for differently than chosen disruption. Witnessing consequence and changing course earns mercy because that change begins to correct the trajectory. But harm that corrupts a system beyond its capacity to repair itself falls into the category the text marks as beyond intercession, not because God is unwilling, but because the mechanism of forgiveness is itself part of the ordered system. And that system has limits. This is what the church removed. Not just the list, the cosmological framework that makes the list intelligible. The framework that says forgiveness is not a feeling or a transaction, but a structural event within a precisely ordered creation, subject to the same constraints as everything else that operates within that order. The 11 copies of Enoch found at Qumran represent at least 3 distinct manuscript traditions, and the variations between them matter. Fragment 4Q 204 from Cave 4 contains Aramaic text corresponding to the Watcher's petition narrative in chapters 12 through 16. The vocabulary used for what the Watchers did is more legally precise in the Aramaic than in the Ge'ez tradition. Where the Ge'ez uses language that can be translated as defiled, the Aramaic uses a term that Florentino Garcia Martinez in his 1994 critical edition, identifies as belonging to the semantic field of covenant violation, a contractual breach with specific legal consequences rather than a ritual impurity requiring purification. This distinction is not minor. Ritual impurity in the ancient world was addressable through purification. Covenant violation was addressable only through restitution or penalty. If the Watcher's Act was a covenant violation, then no purification ritual could touch it. The only available outcomes were penalty or restitution. Since what they did produced irreversible consequences, restitution was impossible. The Church translated the Watcher's sin as a story about sexual immorality. The Qumran Aramaic preserves it as a story about contractual betrayal with no available repair mechanism. The difference between those two readings determines everything about what the text is saying regarding forgiveness. Sexual immorality is forgivable in virtually every theological tradition. Covenant violation that produces irreversible consequences is a structurally different category. Enoch, read in its Aramaic precision, is making a precise legal argument about categories, not a moral argument about severity. Jerome could read that argument. He chose not to preserve it. Everything the previous sections have established makes the positive list in Enoch more precise, not less. If forgiveness is a structural event operating within a precisely ordered system, then what gets forgiven is what can be corrected within the system's capacity. Enoch's text, across the parables and the later sections, is specific about what those things are. First, suffering accepted rather than inflicted. The afflicted class receives divine protection from accusation as described in chapter 40. The mechanism is not that suffering earns merit. It is that harm which falls on someone without their generating it represents a disruption the system accounts for on their behalf. Second, witnessing and turning. The chapter 50 sequence of seeing consequence and choosing differently represents a structural correction. The individual trajectory changes direction. The downstream harm that would have been produced does not occur. This is repairable disruption, and the text treats it as such. Third, the maintenance of covenant honesty. The J.E.'s passages in the later chapters describe a category of person who lives without pretense toward the divine order. This is not the same as being sinless. It is a posture of accuracy, of not adding false self-representation to whatever other disruptions one's actions may have produced. Fourth, the active protection of the vulnerable. Across multiple Enochic passages, care directed toward those who cannot protect themselves produces a response in the divine accounting, described with language indicating structural correction. An act that redirects protective capacity toward those who need it and who cannot reciprocate is treated as a net positive for the system, a move that partially compensates for harm caused elsewhere. None of these conditions require an institutional mediator. None of them require a priest, a doctrinal statement, or a ritual performed by certified authority. They are direct transactions between an individual's actions and the ordered system within which those actions occur. That is precisely why the Church could not keep this book in the canon. If forgiveness is an institutional product, Enoch is a competitor. If forgiveness is a structural event that individuals navigate directly, the institution becomes optional. Laodicea in 364 CE made the institutional choice. 16 centuries of Western theological teaching have followed from that choice. The Ge'ez manuscripts at Axum are not fully accessible to outside researchers. Since the Ethiopian Revolution of 1974, the church archives have been classified as National Cultural Heritage. Dr. James Vanderkam of Notre Dame, one of the foremost living scholars of Second Temple Judaism and Enochic literature, applied for access in 1988. He applied again in 1997. Both applications were declined without explanation in the public record. The Qumran fragments are available through the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library Project, which completed high-resolution multispectral imaging of virtually all cataloged fragments in 2016. The Enochic material is included, but a subset of the fragments, specifically those corresponding to the Parables section, have not been included in the public digital release. They appear in the scholarly catalog. They are not accessible in the digital library. The stated reason is ongoing conservation assessment. That assessment has been pending since 2017. The parables are the section that contains the positive forgiveness list. They are the section that describes the afflicted class, the witnessing sequence, and the structural framework for what mercy actually means in the Enochic system. The manuscripts that contain those passages are the ones that remain out of reach. Enoch's forgiveness framework, assembled across the Book of the Watchers, the Parables, and the Astronomical Book, produces a coherent theological position that is genuinely unlike what any major Western tradition teaches. It is not that God is unwilling to forgive. The text is explicit that mercy is abundant and that the Lord of Spirits is long-suffering. It is that forgiveness operates within the structure of a precisely ordered creation. It is not an override of that structure. It is a feature of how the structure handles disruption, and like any system, it has regions of disruption that exceed its repair capacity. What falls within repair capacity? Harm that does not permanently restructure what it touches, suffering accepted without inflicting further harm, the choice to change course after witnessing consequence, the maintenance of honesty about one's own position in the order, and the active protection of the vulnerable. What falls outside repair capacity? Harm that permanently corrupts systems beyond their self-repair threshold, and the destruction of one's own capacity to access the forgiveness channel. The Church did not teach this because the Church needed forgiveness to be universally available through institutional channels. Enoch's framework made forgiveness real, specific, and structurally honest in ways that made it partially unavailable. That partial unavailability was the unacceptable part. 11 copies of this text survived in caves near the Dead Sea for 2,000 years. The Ethiopian Church preserved the complete version in cedar boxes for 1,500 years. The text says what it says. The council voted in 364 CE. The manuscripts still exist. What gets forgiven, according to the oldest surviving version of this teaching, is exactly what was described in this video. Not everything, not nothing. The specific categories that can be corrected within a precisely ordered system by individuals who take the structural steps required for correction. That is not what the Church teaches. That is what the text says. These are not interpretations layered over vague source material. These are the passages themselves, the specific language of the oldest surviving manuscripts, the exact categories the ancient scribes recorded and the councils later buried. The document linked below carries the full reconstruction, alongside the original Ge'ez text, the Qumran Aramaic variants, and the complete chain of decisions that kept this framework out of Western teaching for 16 centuries. The QR code is on your screen now. If you found this compelling, the next video covers what Enoch says about the specific judgment criteria that will be applied at the end of the current age. Not the general language of mainstream eschatology. The specific criteria. The text names them. It is on your screen now. The link is also in the description below.